Today we're going to be writing percents as decimals and decimals as percents. In addition, we will be approximating percents. Our goal is to apply previous understanding of fraction and decimals to percents. I will be showing you quite a few tips and tricks to help you remember which direction to go with the decimal. First, let's review. We remember that a percent is a portion over 100. For example, 10% is equivalent to 10 over 100. We can write a percent as a fraction or a decimal. So we can write 10% as 10 over 100, or simplify as 1/10. We can also write it as 1/10. The decimal form. And again, 1/10 is the same as 10 hundredths. So these are both the same. Some common mistakes is that students will move the decimal in the wrong direction or the wrong number of times. It's important that the number of times you remember is always 2. Always going to move the decimal twice when dealing with percents. In addition, it's important to know that going from a percent to a decimal is always to the left, and going from a decimal to a percent is always to the right. And we'll go into this more detailed in a few minutes. Another common mistake is that students will divide fractions incorrectly. For example, 1/2 should be 1 divided by 2, which is written this way, 1 divided by 2, not 2 divided by 1. 2 divided by 1 is 2. So be careful when transferring it to a division, especially when you rewrite it these ways. A thing that you can use to avoid getting the wrong answer is to always ask yourself first, is this a proper fraction? Meaning the numerator is less than the denominator. If it is, you know you should get a decimal, not a whole number. That can help you avoid some mistakes. So, how do I write a percent as a decimal? Well, there's a few things you need to remember. When writing percents as decimals, we always move it 2 spaces, in both cases, but in 2 spaces to the left. To the left, to the left, always 2. So what you do is you look at the percent, start at the decimal, and if there is no decimal, of course, you start at the end of the number, and you move it 2 spaces, 1, 2, again, to the left, and then you can rewrite it as a decimal, 0 and 58 hundredths. And literally this says 58 hundredths. Remember, percents is per hundred. Moving on to 7%. Again, start at the decimal, or the end if there is no decimal, and move it 2 spaces to the left, to the left, to the left, and stop. Now, what do you suppose we should do if there's nothing there in that space? Well, it's important to know that if there's a blank space there, we can fill it with a 0. So our decimal is 0 and 0 hundredths. Again, 7% is 7 per hundred. A common mistake is students will tell me 7/10 is 7%. Remember, these are not equal. And again, think of decimals as money. 7% is 7 cents. 7 hundredths is the same as 7 cents. Whereas 7/10, or remember we can always add zeros after, would be the same as 70 cents. So these are not equal. Again, using that analogy of money is usually a really great way of avoiding those common mistakes. So remember, 7%, 7 hundredths Place value matters. Now let's look at 64 and 1/10 percents. Again, you always start at the decimal. A common mistake is students will say 1, 2, and say 6 and 41 hundredths. And that is not equivalent. We start at the decimal. So let's go back and start at the decimal, which is here. And we move it 2 to the left, and stop. And you, of course, just put a 0 as your placeholder. But if you were to write it without that 0, 641 thousandths, that's okay, but it is traditional to have that 0 there. So this would be 0 and 641 thousandths. This is a key one to really take note on, and this is something that you can definitely put into your questions and wonderings on your notes, Cornell note style, of course, is that you really need to make sure you start at the decimal when you have a percent that has a decimal in it. And we're definitely going to practice with these in class as well. So, how do I write a decimal as a percent? Again, always 2 spaces, but we're not going to go to the left. Let's look at these examples. Writing decimals as percents. If we go to the left when writing a percent as a decimal, where do you think we're going to go? If we're going the opposite formula, oh, that's right, the opposite direction. 2 spaces to the right. I didn't want to write lyrics from the song because I didn't want to confuse you. So we have to the right. Again, always start at the decimal. So we start at the decimal, and then we move to the right. To the right. Not left, but right. And then we write a percent after it. So in this case, we have 27%. In our next case, again, we start at the decimal, start right at the decimal, and move it 2 spots, always 2. 1, 2 to the right. You don't have to write 0.9% because if we have a 0 in front of a number and it's a whole number, we don't need it there. So you can write 9%. Again, if you get into the habit of saying decimals properly as tenths, hundredths, thousandths, and not just calling them 0.9, 0.09, that's going to help you as well. Because, again, 9% is 9 hundredths, 9 over 100. So using the analogy of fractions can also help you. If you're not sure how to associate fractions and decimals, go back to the previous tutorials where I discussed that in more detail. Now looking at our next problem, to the right, to the right. Again, start at the decimal. Common mistake is students will tell me that this is 84%. What did that student do wrong? That's right. They moved the decimal 3 spots instead of 2. So 1, 2 gives us 8 4/10%. And again, if it helps, you can say, well, this would be 84 over 1,000, which means that in order to make it over 100, I'd have to move the decimal on the bottom once, and whatever I do to the top, the bottom I have to do to the top to make it an equivalent expression. So using that fraction decimal association can really help you. Now let's look at when we need to approximate percents. Haley saves 2/3 of her allowance. What percent of her allowance does she save? So we have the fraction 2/3, and we need to associate that with a percent. When we find a percent, we have a good strategy, of course, instead of saying is a percent over 100, like we did in the previous tutorials, there's another way we can do it. We can turn it into a decimal as well. 2 divided by, again, don't get it confused, this is a proper fraction, which means that in my answer I should get a decimal. 2 divided by 3. So you use that to get your decimal. 3 can go into 2 0 times. So I add a decimal. 3 can go into 20 6 times. That gives me 18. 6 times 3 is 18. and a remainder of 2. Again, see the pattern that it's repeating? So I know that I'm going to get 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6 for the rest of my life if I keep dividing. So this is a repeating 6. That's my decimal, 0.6 repeating. I want you to take a minute and look at this and tell me what percent do you think this is going to be? Okay, so tell yourself, is this 6%, 60%, or 66%? That's right, it's 66%. And actually, I always tell students to round to the nearest hundredths or tenths. So you could say 66.6 repeating percent. I prefer to round to the nearest tenths in this case. It would be 66.7. That's because this is not 6 and a 0 after. It's 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, and I'll just write a few of them, and then we move it to the left, and then again I can just round. So this is about 66 7/10%. So Haley saves approximately 66 7/10% of her allowance. Using context clues, I hope that you figured out that approximating means finding the approximate answer, or to come close or to be similar to something in quantity. Now it's your turn. You're going to write the percent as a decimal or the decimal as a percent. Remember, follow Layla's advice. Always move the decimal only 2 spaces. And then remember, when do we go to the left? When do we go to the right? Go ahead and take a minute to pause the tutorial and try these problems out on your own. In this lesson, we wrote percents as decimals and decimals as percents. Furthermore, we approximated percents. In other words, when we get a repeating decimal, it's important to know how to write it as a percent. I hope this helped you when figuring out math problems. Now you're ready to start finding percents of numbers in greater situations. Always remember, only move the decimal 2 places. In addition, whenever we write the percent as a decimal, it's always to the left, Whenever we're writing a decimal as a percent, we move it 2 spaces to the right. Another great job, and remembering those details will help you out as you go further.